Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com.
And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were men that were dancing, creeping, and crooked, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's a tantalus? Or a gasogene? And what's the difference between a hansom cab and a four-wheeler?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 469, The Man Who Was Wanted. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you should feel very wanted around here.
I do. You know, my photograph is in the post office, and many of my neighbors come to ask me, how's it going? And if I've checked in with my parole officer lately, and I can't think why.
Now, that's why we do these little weekly sessions. Check in.
Thank you.
Well, you will always make my top 10 list, my friend.
Oh, thank you.
So we are here with the final entry in the series we've been doing in this season about the Apocrypha of Sherlock Holmes, stories that may or may not have been written by Conan Doyle, that may or may not have included Sherlock Holmes. It's a very loose definition, as you can understand, but they are not part of the official canon of 60 stories. They are, however, part of the overall story about the evolution of the character, its spread, etc. And we thought it was worth investigating with you here. The story we are going to talk about today is The Man Who Was Wanted, and I think you'll be interested because we're spending less time on the plot of the actual story than we are on the confusion and drama around its introduction to the public. So stay tuned for that. If you would like to help us keep running this show into the ground or into season 10, whatever it may be, we're happy to have your help. You can do that on Patreon and at Substack. It's trifles.substack.com or patreon.com/trifles. And you can support us for as little as $1 a month. You can also become a member, a follower, or what have you for no cost on either of these platforms. But we also encourage you to go to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. That's our homepage or website, and sign up for email updates there as well. And of course, on whatever podcast platform you happen to be listening to us on, please make sure you're following us there. We do appreciate your support all throughout the year and continue to give you new options as we have with the Sherlock Holmes merchandise site we have. You can buy Trifles notepads and Trifles mugs, among other things. Check it out at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise. Well, Bert, I do have to say we had not originally planned this episode until James O'Leary came forward and reminded us of The Man Who Was Wanted. And it's appropriate that it should be James because he wrote a piece for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, in June of 2014 that outlined the entirety of the Apocrypha. And, of course, he was very helpful in mentioning The Man Who Was Wanted there. And that is where he notes its origin, going all the way back to 1910. So why don't we back up the bus here and start at the beginning for what we know about the origins of this Nova 57 Minor?
Well, interestingly enough, and you mentioned there the title of a book about all this by John Lullenberg, Nova 57 Minor. This takes us back, even though you mentioned, the origins of this back in 1910, this takes us to a time in the 1940s when there's a good deal bubbling around in the world of Sherlock Holmes because Conan Doyle's two sons, Dennis and Adrian, are in the midst of dealing with biographers, things they like, things they don't like. But they're at the point where Hesketh Pearson, whom we've talked about before, is working on a biography of Arthur Conan Doyle and looking through some family papers. And what does Hesketh Pearson find in 1942? But a story that seems to him to be an unknown Sherlock Holmes story. Now, this is one of these vague areas here because there's a little confusion about it. On the one hand, some people say the manuscript supposedly appears to be in Doyle's handwriting. But, as John Lullenberg pointed out in his book, Nova 57 Minor, the manuscript was typewritten. And then what happens is in August 1943, the Strand magazine publishes extracts of it, and then time passes, and what happens in 1948 is Cosmopolitan magazine publishes the story, and in the interval there, in the mid 40s, what happens is even though the BSI at this point has decided that okay, well, this I guess is part of the canon. It's not the world's best Sherlock Holmes story. Might be a little inferior. Vincent Starrett perhaps has thought, well, maybe this is not by Conan Doyle. Well, it turns out that Pearson gets a letter from Arthur Whitaker, who in his own right was an interesting fellow. This unknown fellow to Pearson writes and says, look, I'm not offended by your remark, Mr. Pearson, that this story isn't up to scratch in terms of being a great work of Conan Doyle's. But you did say it was, it had some really authentic elements. Well, that's a great compliment to me because this is my one and only effort at plagiarism because I wrote this in 1911 and I sent it off to Conan Doyle suggesting we could publish it as a joint collaboration. And Conan Doyle sent me 10 guineas and bought the thing. Didn't want to collaborate on it. But, by the way, I have a carbon copy of it. And, I really did write it. And I don't want anything for it. I just want you to know that I wrote it, and not Conan Doyle. And, well, there's a brouhaha around this. And Dennis and Adrian don't necessarily agree, and they think they're being taken advantage of, and then they find out after everybody looks at the carbon copy and so on, that, okay, I guess Whitaker really was the author here. Whitaker, by the way, was a Sheffield architect. He had, if you check out a little bit about Arthur Whitaker, you find out his papers are at the Bodleian Library, and they have this little short bio of him. Arthur Whitaker was a Sheffield architect with a particular passion for spending all of his spare time hunting for birds' nests. He was born in 1881 and died of a heart attack in July of 1949, aged 68 years old, having retired to a country life at Longridge, Gloucestershire in 1946. He's recorded as being a man of retiring disposition who sought happiness in the company of birds.
I have to say, I have seen the remnants of his hunting expeditions for birds' nests. And when hunting birds' nests, it is wise, I would think, based on what I've seen, not to use buckshot. Because it really looked like a series of piles of sawdust as a result. No, I think he left them in place when he hunted them. So that's
It's
a good
possible,
thing.
yes.
But yeah, this is the great controversy now, because on the one hand, you could say that perhaps the Conan Doyle estate was nearly hoodwinked by Hesketh Pearson, and we have evidence of probably passionate letters from Adrian, who was known to get a little hot under the collar when it came to dealing with things related to Sherlock Holmes. Edgar Smith, of course, recall in his correspondence between the Baker Street irregulars and the Doyle estate, because the Doyle estate didn't like how the irregulars treated Holmes as a real person. Edgar Smith was the recipient of some of this ire, and his nickname for Adrian was Adrenaline. So that is indicative of the hot under the collar, hot and bothered Adrian Conan Doyle. So when we note that there is some public outcry, how dare Hesketh Pearson try to sully the reputation of Conan Doyle? And poor Hesketh Pearson is like, I've just written a biography of the man, and I did nothing but admire him and shower him with praise. And what I think is interesting is that in the foreword of Nova 57 Minor, John Lellenberg notes that Edgar Smith thought that it was either a deliberate hoax by the Conan Doyle estate, or else a mark of the incredible stupidity which has marked so many of their actions. and you have to think, at this time, the early 1940s, late 1940s, Sherlock Holmes, it's only about 10, 15 years after the death of Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes is at his height, coming off of the 14 films from Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, mostly with Universal there. The estate must be capitalizing on all of this attention to Sherlock Holmes, still very much in copyright, and noting that there is a 61st story out there, this wonderful discovery, would have been a boon to the estate. So you can imagine that they would have been complicit in trying to pull off a hoax, if indeed that was the angle they took.
Well, it's interesting, Edgar's view of it, and it's surprising, at least now. Of course, it's easy for me to say that because we know the story, but it's surprising, I think, that anyone would think that someone had written, Conan Doyle had written this. For example, and by the way, I am no authority here. Like you, listeners, I've just read, these cases over and over and over again. But the story begins. Let me just tell you how the story begins. The story begins with a sentence and a long paragraph. And here's the sentence. During the late autumn of '95, a fortunate chance enabled me to take some part in another of my friend Sherlock Holmes's fascinating cases. And now here's the paragraph. My wife not having been well for... I'm going to read this quickly just because it's long. My wife not having been well for some time, I had at last persuaded her to take a holiday in Switzerland in the company of her old friend from school, Kate Whitney, whose name may be remembered in connection with the strange case I've already chronicled under the title of The Man with the Twisted Lip. My practice had grown much, and I'd been working very hard for many months and never felt in more need myself of a rest and a holiday. Unfortunately, I dared not absent myself for a long enough period to warrant a visit to the Alps. I promised my wife, however, that I would get a week or 10 days holiday in somehow, and it was only on this understanding that she consented to the Swiss tour I was anxious for her to take. One of my best patients was in a very critical state at the time, and it was not until August was gone that he passed the crisis and I began to recover. Feeling then that I could leave my practice with a good conscience in the hands of a locum tenens, I began to wonder where and how I should best find the rest and change I needed. And then there's another 2-sentence paragraph after that. Almost at once, the idea came to my mind that I would hunt up my friend Sherlock Holmes, of whom I had seen nothing for several months. If he had no important inquiry at hand, I would do my uttermost to persuade him to join me. Now, that is not Conan Doyle. If Conan Doyle were writing that introduction, here's what he would have written. During the late autumn of 1995, my wife not having been well for some time, I had at last persuaded her to take a holiday in Switzerland. Almost at once the idea came to my mind that I would hunt up my old friend Sherlock Holmes, of whom I had seen nothing for several months. Within half an hour of coming to this resolution, I was standing in the doorway of the old familiar room in Baker Street. That's what Conan Doyle would have written. Conan Doyle takes you right into the action, usually with somebody speaking. You wouldn't have all this huge paragraph about Watson nattering on about this, that, and the other thing. There's no way Conan Doyle would have written that.
You know, Vincent Starrett's friend, Charles Collins, who also worked at the Chicago Tribune, suggested renaming it The Case of the Editor Who Was Needed.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the little asides here that come with the... Yeah, it's not just the story itself. And the story itself is fine. It's basically a locked room mystery that there's a banker who's been... Or there's a man who's been defrauding a series of 12 banks by passing bad checks, and he makes his escape on an ocean liner, and then the liner arrives in New York, and he's nowhere to be found. So it's kind of a locked room mystery at sea, and Holmes determines that he never actually got on the liner in the first place, and these fraudulent checks were a series of events that were aiding him in his potential disappearance.
Well, actually what happens is he is on the liner. He just took 2 rooms. And the room he's supposed to be in turns out to be empty. But he took a second room, and so he gets off the liner in disguise.
Oh, there you go.
And in fact, he is actually on the same return voyage, because I think Lestrade meets the boat wherever it winds up, meets the ship. He's actually with Lestrade in disguise on the way back to England, it turns out.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, so that part of it is really
shows you how little I
nice.
have invested in this actual story. Less than the Doyle brothers, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can understand, Conan Doyle. I mean, if I was Conan Doyle and it was 1911, I would say, well, wait a minute now. So 2 rooms. Okay. I hadn't thought of that. Great. Here's 10 guineas.
Oh. So, in kind of getting back to the controversy here, the Doyle estate, let's see what happened here. So Pearson, Hesketh Pearson, the biographer, didn't want to get in the middle of things, so he put Whitaker, the actual author of the piece, in touch with Starrett. And since the story had been published under Conan Doyle's name, Whitaker, as we said before, wanted the truth out. And he proved his case, as you said, with those carbon copies and everything. And that's when the Doyle family, wanted the actual proof. They got the carbon copies. Can you show one scrap of evidence? Well, of course, here are my carbon copies. And Adrian, as Bob Byrne writes up on Blackgate.com, Adrian had declared war on a befuddled Whitaker. And Whitaker thought he was doing the estate a favor by not remaining quiet with the British publication upcoming. More publicity here. And after all, the story wasn't written by Conan Doyle. And anyway, Conan Doyle's letter got returned to Whitaker, the original, and at a February 1949 meeting between the lawyers for both sides, the estate acknowledged the validity of his claim and then paid him £150, which was a pittance of the reported U.S. funds that they had received. And all of 21 of those pounds, all but 21, went to his legal expenses. So poor Arthur Whitaker, he got £10 up front from Conan Doyle and another 21 net from the estate for his troubles.
Yeah.
And then a letter from Adrian in 1963 was the first time that the estate publicly admitted that Conan Doyle didn't write The Man Who Was Wanted.
unbelievable, really unbelievable.
Makes for good drama, you know?
Well, it does, you know, and in John Lellenberg's book that we mentioned about all this, Nova 57 Minor, there's a little mention by John about the brothers' engagement and reactions to Hesketh Pearson. Actually, that sort of goes in different places throughout the book. But what happens is that when Pearson's book is originally published, Adrian writes to Pearson after the publication of the book, and Adrian says, "I'm most interested to hear that the book is already sold out and that the new edition will be on the market for Christmas. It is a rightful reward for your long months of reading and work." Well, that doesn't last very long, because at the end of February 1944, after a recuperative stay following an operation in hospital, Adrian claims then to have just read Pearson's biography of his father for the first time. This portrayal of my father, his background, his character, his status as a man, is a travesty. The morbid, slow-minded son of the people Englishman depicted in your book, a character built on sweeping and entirely unwarranted generalization and potent omissions, has no relation whatsoever to the character and attributes of the blood-proud man who was my father. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. That Pearson then writes to George Bernard Shaw. Now, Pearson had done a biography of Bernard Shaw. And Pearson writes, quote, "Adrian is obviously insane." He sees no fault in his father, and on at least 2 occasions he wrote abusive letters to critics of my book who had implied his father was a bit of an ass. And Bernard Shaw writes back, "Let nothing induce you to argue with this man. It could do no good, and it will be an expensive and very wearing waste of time."
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and in the closing essay, last couple of pages of his book, Lellenberg writes that Adrian would see Pearson as that bogus fellow, and worse, a professional liar, a malicious purveyor of falsehoods and disparagements against Adrian's revered father. And it was Arthur Whitaker who was to blame for the trouble that Adrian had had over the man who was wanted. Certainly not Adrian himself. No, not in the least. The man who was wanted was something of a milestone in the development of the Conan Doyle estate's hostile attitude toward Sherlock Holmes pastiches and those who wrote them. Except, of course, when Adrian decided to write some himself a few years later. The estate's attitude had never been generous, of course, and Adrian Conan Doyle, no doubt, felt himself like the poor little Dutch boy trying to plug up all the holes in the dike to keep out a rising tide of vile imitations of his father's stories. When he learned that Ellery Queen had unwittingly reprinted some passages from Sherlock Holmes stories that he had obtained permission for in his anthology 100 Years Entertainment, The Great Detective Stories, in 1941, Adrian used the inadvertent copyright infringement to force Queen to withdraw his 1944 anthology of Sherlockian parodies and pastiches, The Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes, from circulation. But if anything more were needed to convince the irascible Adrian Conan Doyle that pastiches were an outrage and their writers contemptible scoundrels, it was his experience of Arthur Whitaker's The Man Who Was Wanted. Adrian clung fiercely to this attitude to the day he died in June 1970, long past Whitaker's death in 1949, or his brother Dennis's in 1955, or even Hesketh Pearson's in 1964. And the effects of his attitude toward imitation Sherlock Holmes adventures by others are still felt today.
Well, you see, if Adrian were still with us, we would have to have him sit down, pour him a little whiskey, and tell him, "Adrian, it's just a trifle."
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Now, tell us quietly and slowly who you are and what it is that you want.